Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, Kevin Pelton of ESPN issued his trade grades now that the Timberwolves trade with the Knicks is official. We'll talk about what I thought was surprising about those trade grades. While the Wolves graded out better than expected, we'll talk about the impact on the depth, specifically Donte DiVincenzo, and also some of Chris FInch's comments from Timberwolves Media Day this week. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Thursday, everybody. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about Media Day, which occurred on Monday of this week. We'll talk about the some of the Chris FInch comments related to the offense. I think pretty aligned with some of the stuff that I've said earlier this offseason. And actually, even in the wake of last season, like in June, I was talking about some of the things about the Wolves offense, what they could improve. Chris FInch has some similar thoughts. We'll get to that toward the end of the show today. First, though, I want to talk about some more Julius Randle, Donte DiVincenzo trade details. It's now official. We'll talk through that, as well as the big, as always, highly anticipated Kevin Pelton trade grades over at ESPN. And he was kinder to the Wolves than I expected. So we'll talk about that here off the top. First, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So Kevin Pelton over at ESPN. I actually spent some time middle of last week, probably exactly a week ago, I would say lambasting his preseason win total projections. Remember, he had the Wolves at what, like 42 point something wins and like 8th in the West or something. And a primary reason for that was the Timberwolves, his analytics model suggested was a lack of depth for the Wolves. This is true. I kind of laughed in the face of that projection last week because my take was, hey, this team won 56 games. They're returning 7 of their top 8 rotation guys. I understand that there's some question marks starting at about number 7.5, 8 on the depth chart on down. However, the overall percentage of minutes, I'd like maybe that ends up hurting them late in the season in the playoffs when guys get worn down. I just think Chris FInch with his rotations, like, I wasn't nearly as worried about it, right? Like, you still got the reigning 6th man of the year. You've still got Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Well, evidently, apparently whoever that 8th guy in the rotation is really matters in Kevin Pelton's model, because Kevin Pelton actually gave the Wolves a better grade in this trade than the New York Knicks. And of course, what I've been saying since the trade went down last Friday night was, look, the Knicks got the best player in the trade. Karl-Anthony Towns, unquestionably the best player that changed teams in this trade, which also now, by the way, includes the Charlotte Hornets. Cat was easily the best player in the trade. I think it makes the Timberwolves worse this season. I actually think it lowers their ceiling a little bit. I had been saying their floor stays the same, might lower a little bit. I might come around on the possibility that I don't think their floor is higher because of the depth, but it maybe didn't change. But I do think it lowered the ceiling because the star power is simply lower for the Timberwolves. Unless, of course, Anthony Edwards makes a mega leap this year and he becomes the best player in the league or a top 3 player, then he probably papers over what went out the door with Cat. But I don't think there's any question the Wolves got worse. But what Pelton's grade did is it factors in the increase in depth, which we'll talk about here in a moment, or the improvement in depth, I should say. And then also he's factoring in the longer-term salary cap ramifications in a positive way for Minnesota. So I'll read a couple excerpts. It's an insider story over at ESPN. The final details of the trade that was worked out officially is, of course, the Knicks get Cat. They also get James Nagy, rights to James Nagy, who I think was a draft pick of the Hornets this year. The Hornets get Dwayne Washington, Charlie Brown Jr., Daquan Jeffries. They also get 3 second-round picks. Only one of them comes from Minnesota, and it's a next-year second-rounder, the worst pick from a Detroit-Philadelphia pick, which, assuming it's Philly, it's probably a bottom 10 in the second-round pick that goes to the Hornets. The Timberwolves then get Randle DiVincenzo. They also get old friend Keita Bates-Diop, second-round pick from the Tibbs era. And they get that first-round pick, which we've talked about next year, that is a top 13 protected pick, assuming Detroit's in the bottom 13 in the league, and that conveys or sticks with Detroit, I should say. The following year, it's like top 12 protected, and then the third year from now, it's like top 9 protected, and then the protections fall off, and it becomes a second-round pick, I think, in 2028. So it may end up being a second-round pick, or in 2 years, Detroit may just say, screw it, we have to stop perpetually rebuilding, and they may become a playoff team, an 8 seed or something, which allows the Wolves to then get that pick, which would probably be right around the time Ant's truly in his prime. And is that trade actually have some value to it? And Pelton talks about that a little bit in his article too. So the first line that Kevin Pelton has is, this is a fascinating trade for the Timberwolves because while they clearly benefit financially, they could end up a better team too. He then says, when Minnesota ended up shockingly low in my stats-based wins projections earlier this week, a key factor was the Timberwolves' lack of reliable depth outside their top 7. Dealing Towns for 2 players who were starters is a plus for Minnesota in this regard. Okay, now here are my thoughts. He's 100% right in the sense that the Timberwolves now have at least 7 guys that are true NBA starters. Their actual starting 5, Donte DiVincenzo and Naz Reid. Those guys are all starting caliber NBA players. Nickeil Alexander-Walker is probably right on the border there. So that gives you not just a strong 8, but maybe the best bench in the league. And Pelton says that somewhere in here. He makes a comment about how the bench may actually be the league's best. That's 100% true. And when you think about your 9th guy being some combination of Joe Ingles or number 8 overall pick and Rob Dillingham, obviously unproven, and Joe Ingles, like both those guys have risk because Ingles is a billion years old, not actually, but he's clearly started to decline. And has been for a while, but can still shoot threes, right? And then Rob Dillingham, who's a diminutive rookie, teenager. There are question marks, but if Joe Ingles is still Joe Ingles and Rob Dillingham's a solid rookie, like that's a really, really good top 10. So that to me, what that tells me is that Pelton's formula might overreact a little bit to whoever the 8th guy is. Like if Donte DiVincenzo plus a downgrade from Towns to Randle is going to have that big of an impact. Now, he didn't like rerun his win total, so we don't know what the actual impact on the projection is, but if his same model is what helps him spit out a B+ grade for Minnesota, I don't know if I said that or not, but he gave them a B+, which I was expecting a B-. He gave the Wolves a B+ for this. He goes on to gush about DiVincenzo, who I'll get more into here in just a moment, but I want to touch on some of the Randle stuff. He says Randle's usage rate is similar to Towns, but he goes about it in a different way, basically saying playing between a traditional point guard like Conley and a playmaker, somebody's going to have the ball in their hands a ton with Anthony Edwards, there won't be as much opportunity for Randle to be in isolation. And then he says what I talked about on yesterday's show. On Wednesday's show, I talked about the potential rotation. I think it was toward the end of the show. Like, hey, Randle's going to start. He leaves the floor. You bring Naz in with Rudy, and then you bring Randle back with Naz. How often are we going to see Randle and Naz play together? And then down the stretch in regulation, in crunch time, of those 3 bigs, if the Wolves are trailing, you're probably going to see, you'll probably see Gobert on the floor if they're leading, right, for defensive reasons, and probably Naz because he's switchable. If they need buckets, you might see Randle and Naz on the floor together, not Rudy, if they're down in the 4th quarter. Like, crunch time isn't going to look the same as the starting lineup. And I also made the point of staggering the minutes of Randle and Edwards, so at least one of them is on the floor almost always. And having Randle go against other teams' bench units is going to be huge if that ends up being the case. Even if Randle's the nominal starter, right? Like, he was an all-star the last 2 seasons. I don't think they're just going to immediately stick him on the bench. I think he starts, but by staggering his minutes, you're going to have him playing against bench units more frequently. And then in crunch time may end up being Naz Reid, depending on the matchup and depending on kind of the game flow on any given night. So the Randle stuff I thought was really interesting. He also talks about the financial implications. I'll just read what he has quickly. He says the Wolves' tax bill is projected at more than $100 million, dealing Towns for two players who combined to make $8.8 million less, cuts at least $25 million off that total. Remember, it's the tax bill, so it's not dollar for dollar. It's more than that, right? And then he talks about potential extension talks that we've discussed here on the show with Gobert and Randle. getting rid of Towns' supermax salary, and then you try and figure out, who you're keeping between Alexander Walker and Reed, and also Gobert and Randle, if they opt out, could be unrestricted free agents. I mentioned the pick already, so he talks about the tradable first-round pick, that they could use it as a trade chip during Edwards' prime in the next couple of years, and how everybody should have seen the trade for Towns coming, which I did. I just didn't think it would happen now. I thought it would happen next summer. I was wrong. All right, I want to talk about the DiVincenzo piece. I want to touch on what Pelton says, but then get into a couple of other things I alluded to the other day about DiVincenzo's fit, and one of the reasons why I think the Wolves really like his fit, not just offensively as a shooter, but what he's going to bring to their rotation defensively, and the different flexibility that it gives Chris FInch as we, look at all the variety of different things Chris FInch could do with already a strong defensive team, but to kind of add to his, call it optionality. I've heard that word a lot related to the Wolves' financial situation. So I think I'm just going to start using it. We'll talk about the optionality that Donte DiVincenzo gives them off the bench here just a little bit as well. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You can get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. This coming Sunday, there's tons of games to look at on the NFL slate. Of course, the Vikings are in London this Sunday. They are taking on the Jets. It's technically a home game for Minnesota. They are favored by 2.5 points over the Jets. I actually would feel pretty good about that. I'm kind of taking the Vikings -2.5. So maybe not the worst idea. That's -110. The money line's -142. I think you just take the money line just take the spread, the -2.5, and live with that. I'm trying to see if there's any other good games out there that I like. Panthers at Bears, I wouldn't touch that one. Patriots, Dolphins, don't touch that one. Bills at Texans, Bills -1.5, I don't like that one either. Colts at Jaguars, nope, not for me. Browns at Commanders, -3 at home. I like Washington. I actually think they legit could be good as long as Jaden Daniels stay healthy. I wouldn't mind taking Commanders -3 at home against the Browns on Sunday at noon. Maybe take a look at that one. Again, you can check out latest stats, live play-by-play, and more on the same page that you're placing your bets. You get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet over at FanDuel. Again, that's FanDuel.com. Okay. So I mentioned Donte DiVincenzo. Let's first say what Kevin Pelton says about DiVincenzo's fit and why it's so important. Pelton says DiVincenzo was one of the league's biggest success stories last season. Signed to a bargain for-year $50 million contract with a non-taxpayer mid-level exception. He was arguably the Knicks' second-best player behind Jalen Brunson in the second half of the year. He averaged 19.3 points after the All-Star break. He shot 4.4 three-pointers per game, second in the NBA during that span. He made 4.4 three-pointers per game, second in the league behind Luka. And I said this the other day. Donte DiVincenzo was actually third in three-pointers attempted and third in three-pointers made league-wide behind only Steph Curry and Luka Doncic last season. And post-All-Star break, he was second in the NBA in makes per game. And Pelton goes on to say the Wolves probably can't count on DiVincenzo shooting the ball quite that well. DiVincenzo shot 40% the year prior, but his volume was way up this last year. I don't know. I don't know why we would think it's fluky if it's continued to improve. It may not be 41%, but if it's 39%, I think we'll sign up for that, right? Then Pelton says DiVincenzo is a proven starter signed through his prime for a reserve-level contract. I've talked about that. Alongside Sixth Man of the Year award winner Naz Reid and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Minnesota now has perhaps the NBA's best bench. The team also won't need to rely on rookies Rob Dillingham and Terrence Shannon Jr. to play heavy minutes right away. Side note there, I still think Rob Dillingham's in the rotation as the quote-unquote backup point guard. But now that going back to optionality, new favorite word here at Locked On Wolves, is Chris FInch could just decide to play Ant and DiVincenzo together in the backcourt, or Ant and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, or DiVincenzo and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Probably less likely to do that. But you can mix and match because, DiVincenzo is not a point guard. Well, neither is Anthony Edwards, neither is Nickeil Alexander-Walker. These guys can all bring the ball up the court, and if Ant's on the floor, the offense is going through him anyway. So depending on the opponent, depending on the time of year, depending on, back-to-back schedule, et cetera, I mean, Mike Conley's not going to play 82 games anyway, right? So like Rob Dillingham's going to get plenty of opportunity, but they are not completely reliant on him. Like say he has a terrible, I don't know. Like say he plays terrible in his first half of his first game. It's a close game down the stretch. I think they're at was it at the Lakers, I think, for opening night. Say he plays horribly in the first half. It's a close game down the stretch. You don't have to put Rob Dillingham on the floor in the fourth quarter to spell Mike Conley if it's a close game. You could, put Nickeil Alexander-Walker on the floor with Donte DiVincenzo or something like that. Now, Dillingham's shooting means that he's going to have, like, in theory, he'll be a better shooter than at least than Alexander Walker and some, McDaniels and some of these other rotation guys. So there's another reason why he could be on the floor. But are you going to have him on the floor and have him run the offense in crunch time early in his career? I think they're going to try. But the point is that they don't have to if it doesn't turn out the way that they would like it to. They can ease Dillingham in a bit more. I don't think TJ Shannon was going to play heavy minutes right away, but I think he's probably the 10th, 11th guy at this point, really kind of on the fringe of the rotation looking in. And then he also points out, going back to the Randle thing briefly, Pelton points out that there's another challenge for Chris FInch of fitting awkward pieces together. And as I've talked about, Julius Randle's not the shooter that Karl-Anthony Towns is. Volume-wise, he kind of sort of is, but make-wise, he's not. And we talked about that the other day, but I wanted to point out that Pelton said that. All right, back to DiVincenzo. He doesn't actually talk about DiVincenzo's defense. Something I mentioned in passing the other day that I wanted to dig in on a bit more that I think is super important to point out is that Donte DiVincenzo, I think he's a solid defender, and I think most people would say that, but I think he's better than people think. And here's why. With the Knicks, DiVincenzo was guarding usage tier 1 and usage tier players, usage tier 1 and usage tier 2 players a bunch. He's not going to have to do that with the Wolves. Why? Because he's always going to be on the floor with all defensive second team Jaden McDaniels, all defensive vote getter Anthony Edwards, Jamal Murray, jailer, if you will, putting Jamal Murray in jail, Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Like any of these guys are going to be on the floor with Donte DiVincenzo. He'll never have to guard the opposing team's best wing player. They may switch him onto, at the point of attack, you may get switched onto a ball handler, fine. But the requirement for Donte DiVincenzo is not, hey, go guard the best player because Jalen Brunson can't do it. That's not what he's signed up for. Or, like obviously when he was on the floor with OG Anunoby, that wasn't necessarily the case. Josh Hart would be the other one that would guard primary type defenders or primary type offensive players. But he played a bunch with Miles McBride. Miles McBride wasn't, at times last year, Miles McBride wasn't guarding the opposing team's best offensive player. Jalen Brunson wasn't guarding the opposing team's. So DiVincenzo was always one of the best two perimeter defenders on the floor for the Knicks. Oftentimes the best. Again, looking at the lineups that were used the most over there. And also, by the way, the ones that were most successful were obviously ones that had both he and Josh Hart on the floor together, or he and OG Anunoby on the floor together, at least defensively. Their very best defensive lineup had all three of those on the floor together. DiVincenzo at the 2, Josh Hart at the 3, OG Anunoby at the 4, Hartenstein at the 5, and of course Jalen Brunson was on the floor in those units. But all that to say, DiVincenzo was being asked to do a lot last year. He's not going to have to do that with Minnesota. And I talked about his off-ball metrics over at B-Ball Index the other day on the show. I think this was maybe Tuesday's show. He got an A from B-Ball Index on steals per 75 possessions, an A in deflections per 75 possessions, and a B- in passing lane defense, which is a good mark. It's above league average, which is a combination of bad pass steals and deflections. He's a solid off-ball defender. He's a smart player. He's a strong team defender. He's not, he's listed at 6'4". He's not huge. His wingspan is 6'6". So 6'4" with a 6'6" wingspan. So not a massive off-ball defender, but a capable off-ball defender, a smart, a heady off-ball defender. And that's going to matter for the Wolves this year. Remember, that's one of the issues that they've had is kind of spacey off-the-ball moments, whether it's Anthony Edwards, at times Karl-Anthony Towns, as much as he was important and got better defensively last year, that has been an issue at times. Certainly going back to the Shake Milton minutes, they had guys who on and off the ball, but especially off the ball, weren't solid. Now you put Jaden McDaniels at the point of attack, you put Nickeil Alexander-Walker, you put Anthony Edwards at the point of attack, and don't make Ant play off ball. Now, of course, the disadvantage to that is wearing him down, and which again, DiVincenzo gives you another option. DiVincenzo is on par with with an Anthony Edwards that's not all the way locked in defensively, right? Like you could put DiVincenzo at the point of attack, let Ant play off the ball, tell him he's got to pay attention, and then that way he's not going to get worn down as quickly over the course of the season. Or if it's a big matchup, Ant's going to get up for, it's crunch time, whatever, put Ant on the ball. DiVincenzo off the ball is scary. And you've got other strong, obviously Rudy Gobert roaming, down low and protecting the paint. That's going to make a big difference. Jaden McDaniel, like there is not a poor defender in this rotation other than Rob Dillingham. Joe Ingles, big body, smart defender, not a great one-on-one defender, but he's a fine team defender. But look at the top 8. Like Naz Reid is the weakest one. And, he has his moments. Sometimes he's great defensively. Sometimes he's not. He's a good weak side shot blocker. He's pretty good in transition. He's certainly at times foul prone. Julius Randle, I would say, actually less foul prone. And we talked about this the other day. And actually, Alex Wolf from Locked On Knicks on the show Monday talked a lot about how impressive Randle's defense was, his physicality, his switchability, can guard multiple positions. I think that maybe has been undersold about Julius Randle. So, yeah, there's a couple like hit and miss guys with Randle and Naz, but like go on down the list. Mike Conley's a good team defender, still good enough at the point of attack against certain guys. Jaden McDaniels, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Donte DiVincenzo, Anthony Edwards, all plus defenders. Rudy Gobert, obviously. Nickeil Alexander, I mentioned him. Like TJ Shannon is another option on the wing. Josh Minot. Like there's so much length and so much athleticism in terms of perimeter defenders for the Wolves, both on and off the ball. DiVincenzo only adds to that and gives Chris FInch even more options to play around with. All right, let's close by talking about Chris FInch's comments about the Wolves offense that he made at Media Day. And I don't know. I think either Finchy listened to Locked On Wolves this spring, or maybe I was just stating the obvious, and great minds think alike about some of the issues with the Wolves offense and relatively easy fixes to help lift the Wolves up from the 16th, 17th best offense, that they were last year. So we'll get to all that here next. All right. So Chris FInch at Media Day on Monday had a comment about the Timberwolves offense. He was asked basically just like, hey, how's this offense going to be better? Because it wasn't as good as it should have been last year. They were, depending on where you look, 16th or 17th in offensive rating, offensive efficiency. And there's a quote by Chris FInch that was transcribed in a couple different places. I'm going to read it from Canis Supis. It was on Twitter as well, various places. Finch said, quote, 3 things stick out of my mind, probably out in my mind, really. I think we can get better in transition. We forced a lot of turnovers. We didn't cash them in quick enough. Team speed has always been a little bit of an issue, but we should still have a bit more of a quick strike mentality. I'll pause there. We'll get to the other two in a minute. Finchy and I are like, we're here. We're almost together on this. He's about halfway to the point that I made. The point I made about the Timberwolves' pace and lack of pace, if you will, I made this multiple times. I don't know when the last time I made the point was. Absolutely, the Wolves need to improve their transition offense, but I don't necessarily think it was only off of steals. We talked about this quite a bit, but offensively in transition, the Timberwolves off of steals, their overall success rate wasn't too bad. So they were third to last in overall frequency of transition plays. I think they're actually dead last at Basketball Reference in pace. Cleaning the Glass uses frequency of, like, what's their frequency of getting out in transition? League average is about 15%. The Wolves are slightly over 13%. Okay. They were 28th in the league in frequency of transition. However, they were third in points per 100 plays. So when they ran, they were good. Take it a step further, this is where I disagree a little bit with Finch. The Wolves were 20th in running off of steals. So not good, like still in the bottom third of the league. They only ran 65% of the time. Less than 2/3 of the time they got a steal did they get out in transition, which seems kind of crazy. League average is 66%, so 2/3. And Washington was number one at 73% of the time they're running off of steals. That should be higher. Yeah, I agree with Finch. However, they were dead last in running off of live rebounds. And I understand that there's an argument to be made for, hey, the Wolves want to slow the game down. They want to play at a slower pace. And so maybe that's what Finch would say to this is like, I don't want to run off live rebounds anyway. I want to, but in my mind, the answer is just don't try and run after makes. That's when things get super sloppy, which is Finch's next point we'll get to in a minute is fixable turnovers. But I think they have the opportunity to run after steals. And also, they, again, dead last in running off of live defensive rebounds. Only under 22% of the time did they run. League average is 29% off a defensive rebound. But still, they were good. They were 9th in the league in points per 100 possessions, points per 100 plays in transition off of live rebounds. There's no reason that a team with Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, and the athletes they have, and I don't, add in Rob Dillingham, Terrence Shannon. Terrence Shannon's a terror in transition. I guarantee you. Chris FInch talked about team speed. Terrence Shannon and Rob Dillingham were two of the fastest players in this rookie class. That's going to make a big difference. Running off of live rebounds to me is a place they could pick up some free points in a game. I'm not saying run after makes. This isn't 7 seconds or less Suns. It's not the Jared Vanderbilt, Patrick Beverly, Chris FInch team. This is a Rudy Gobert Timberwolves team. They can play slow. They can make a game be a lower number of possessions. That makes sense, but it doesn't mean you should abandon opportunities for easy offense, especially when you've got 9 of 10 rotation guys as average or better 3-point shooters. Majority of your rotation guys plus 3-point shooters and guys that are athletes that can score in transition, get to the free throw line. That's why transition is so valuable. It's open threes and it's getting fouled. And if you're not doing those things, you're getting a dunk or a layup. Transition should be easy points, and the Wolves just aren't taking advantage of those opportunities for easy points, or at least didn't last year. The next thing that Finch mentioned was turnovers in the crowd, careless ones you can control. We've talked about that. You look at the 4 factors, and Minnesota was one of the worst teams in terms of turnover rate last year. Over at Cleaning the Glass, we'll look there. Again, the difference between Cleaning the Glass and Basketball References, Cleaning the Glass takes out heaves and garbage times. The Wolves were 23rd in turnover rate. Despite being, 16th in offense and good in some other categories, turnovers were something that really hurt them. And Chris Finch pointed that out in his media day interview. And then the last thing would be, he calls this most important, would be clutch offense, decision-making, offensive efficiency at the end of games, and also end to quarters. This is 100% true. It's also a really hard thing to rep and replicate without actually getting real live game reps. You could practice it, but you can't simulate the end of an actual game. And this is one of the reasons why a conference finals run, it is valuable to have these reps under your belt if you're Anthony Edwards or you're the Wolves more broadly, but especially somebody who carries as much on his shoulders as Ant, has as many opportunities with the ball in his hands as Ant, and is obviously their best player and leader. Those reps do matter. I think sometimes we overplay experience and it just gets thrown around like veterans and all this stuff. Calm down. These guys can all play basketball. They're all pro basketball players. I think that can get overblown. But dealing with situations like close games, playoff games, close playoff games, that does matter. And I think repetition matters there. And now Ant has that. He's been in the playoffs 3 times. And he's now been in the conference finals. He's played in the Olympics. He's had more of these experiences to learn. And Finch didn't call it Ant specifically, but I'm bringing him up because he's the guy that's going to be, the onus is going to be on Ant at the end of these games. So Finchie's right on. Team speed / transition opportunities to get some easy buckets, turnovers, getting rid of the careless ones, and then clutch offense. Spot on. All stuff we've talked about here on the show, which, pat myself on the back, Locked On Wolves. We're also spot on identifying some of these things. So we'll talk a bit more about some of those areas here as we move through the rest of the offseason. I don't know. The Wolves play Friday night. There's a preseason game Friday night. Friday show. I think I'll spend a little bit more time on potential rotation stuff. We'll wait till next week to do player previews. But we'll also talk a little bit about Friday night's game. And then I think what we'll do is Monday, we'll do kind of a post-game pod off the preseason. Of course, we're not going to get to see any of the new players that the Knicks trade got finalized Wednesday. So Julius, Randle, DiVincenzo, these guys aren't going to play Friday. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that matchup and I guess what we should look out for on Friday's show as well. As we, I guess get closer to real actual basketball. They're at the Lakers Friday night. It's a 9:30 p.m. Central tip on NBA TV. So we'll definitely talk about that on Friday. All right, that's all we have for today here on the show. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow at X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen. Now, for your second listen, check out the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Show. Become a fantasy basketball expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Josh Lloyd. Find Locked On Fantasy Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.